Isabella Hartley had never been more desperate, the rain soaking through her thin cloak as she hurried down the cobbled streets of London, the evening dark and cold, the kind of chill that sank into your bones and refused to let go, her heart pounding not just from the sharp wind but from the urgency of the moment. She had to get away. If she stayed any longer, she knew her cousin Harold would force her to marry Mr. Grimsby, the elderly merchant who had been pursuing her for months. He was rich. Yes, but he was also cruel and repulsive, and Isabella had no intentions of being shackled to such a man for the rest of her life. Her footsteps faltered as she reached the busy coaching inn, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilling from the open doors. It was a haven for travelers, a place to rest before continuing their journeys, but Isabella wasn't stopping for a drink or a warm meal. She was fleeing. With only £3 to her name, she couldn't afford a coach, but she could slip into one, just one ride to somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't her cousin's house. The carriages were lined up outside the inn, their drivers chatting among themselves. Isabella's eyes scanned them quickly, her breath misting in the cold air. She needed to be quick, to find a carriage that was headed far from London. She couldn't afford to wait. Her gaze landed on one, parked slightly apart from the others, the gold crest gleaming in the flickering lamplight, the symbol of a noble house. She didn't notice the driver standing just a few paces away, his attention elsewhere. Desperation clouded her judgment. Without thinking, she slipped into the carriage, settling into the plush seat with a sigh of relief. She hadn't meant to climb into a nobleman's carriage, but at that moment, she didn't care. She closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to steady her breath, trying to gather her thoughts. Perfect, a woman's voice purred from across the carriage, cutting through the silence. Isabella's eyes snapped open. Across from her sat a woman, tall, with sharp features and an easy smile that seemed both knowing and predatory. She was dressed in rich fabrics, her posture elegant yet unnervingly relaxed. Isabella stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. "I'm sorry, I thought this was my ride. I must have." The woman's smile only grew wider. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. Isabella Hartley, runaway from a forced marriage, aren't you?" Isabella froze. There was something about the way the woman spoke that made her feel trapped, as though she had just stepped into a carefully laid trap. She opened her mouth to protest, but the woman raised a hand, silencing her. "Relax," the woman continued smoothly. "I'm not here to hurt you. Quite the opposite. In fact, you're exactly who my brother needs." "My brother?" Isabella echoed, confused and a little alarmed. The woman's eyes glinted with something sharp and calculating. "Yes, my brother, Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth. He's rather distant these days. He needs someone, and I've decided that someone should be you." Isabella blinked. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. It's quite simple, really," the woman interrupted. "I'm Lady Charlotte Ashworth, and I've been searching for the perfect woman for my brother, someone strong, intelligent, and unconventional." She leaned forward, her smile widening. "Someone like you." Before Isabella could respond, the carriage lurched forward, pulling away from the inn. She gasped, her hand flying to the door, but it was already too late. They were moving, leaving the bustle of the city behind. The lamplights flickered past the window, casting strange shadows on the walls. She was being taken somewhere, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Lady Charlotte Ashworth sat back in her seat, her fingers tapping idly on the armrest. "I can see you're confused, perhaps even a little frightened, but trust me, you're exactly where you need to be." Isabella, her pulse racing, tried to make sense of what was happening. You're kidnapping me." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Kidnapping? Oh, dear, no. This is all very civil, I assure you. You just don't know it yet. I've already spoken with my brother's butler. He'll see to your comfort when we arrive at Ashworth Manor." Isabella swallowed hard, trying to wrap her mind around what Charlotte was saying. Ashworth Manor? But I don't even know your brother. I don't. That's where you're wrong," Charlotte cut in. "You'll know him soon enough, and I can promise you, he'll be glad to have you there." She smiled again, this time with a little more mischief in her eyes. "You see, my brother is cold, distant, and rather miserable. He needs a wife, but not just any wife. He needs someone who can challenge him, someone who can get under his skin." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what kind of game this woman was playing, but she had no choice but to listen. "And you want me to be his wife?" Charlotte shrugged, her expression almost playful. "Not immediately. I'm not that cruel. I'm simply offering you a chance, a trial, if you will. You stay at Ashworth Manor for 1 month. If it works out, then perhaps there's something more. If not, you're free to leave. No harm done." Isabella sat back, her mind racing. She had no idea who this woman was or what her motives were, but something told her she had just stumbled into a strange, complicated world, one that she had no way of predicting. Charlotte leaned forward again, her gaze sharp and calculating. "But I will say this, my brother is devastatingly handsome, but he's cold as winter, and he's not the easiest man to win over, so try not to fall for him too quickly." Isabella's stomach fluttered at the thought, but there was something in Charlotte's voice, something almost predatory. She had no idea what she was walking into, but one thing was certain, she wasn't just a pawn in a matchmaking scheme. She was about to become entangled in a world far beyond her understanding. The carriage rolled on, the sound of the wheels cutting through the night, and Isabella couldn't help but wonder what awaited her at Ashworth Manor. "One small detail," Charlotte said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Alexander doesn't know I'm doing this. Try not to mention that finding him a wife part. He's touchy about matchmaking. Oh, and he's devastatingly handsome but cold as winter. Don't fall for him too quickly." The journey to Ashworth Manor was long and silent, the carriage rattling over uneven roads as the night deepened. Isabella barely slept, her mind racing with questions and doubts. By the time they arrived, it was nearly midnight, and the manor loomed ahead, its stone walls dark against the night sky, a grand, imposing estate. It seemed as cold and uninviting as the Duke who resided within. Isabella's heart fluttered uneasily in her chest as the carriage pulled up to the front steps. Lady Charlotte led the way, guiding her into the manor with ease, as though she belonged. Isabella, in contrast, felt as if she were stepping into a foreign world, one that might swallow her whole. The grand entry hall smelled of rich wood and the faint scent of lavender, and everything about the place whispered wealth and power, but it was the woman waiting inside that caught Isabella's attention first. Dowager Duchess Catherine, tall and regal, her sharp eyes took in Isabella with a knowing look, and though she said little, there was a warmth to her that immediately put Isabella at ease. "She has kind eyes," Catherine said softly, as if to herself. "That's what he needs, kind eyes." Isabella didn't know whether to be flattered or unnerved, but Lady Charlotte simply nodded, her lips curling into a smile. "Exactly. Now, you rest. The Duke will meet you tomorrow." With no more explanation, Charlotte escorted Isabella to a guest room. The luxurious bed and the plushness of the room left Isabella speechless. She sank into the soft blankets, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. She had gone from running for her life to being presented as a guest of honor at a ducal estate. As she lay there, trying to sleep, her mind whirred with the implications of everything that had happened in the past few hours. The next morning, after a restless night, Isabella was summoned to breakfast. The Duke, Alexander Ashworth, was already seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as she entered. He barely acknowledged her presence, offering a stiff nod as she sat down across from him. His demeanor was cool, distant, almost intimidating. "I trust you slept well," he said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Isabella nodded, unsure of how to respond. The silence between them was thick, and she could feel the tension building as they ate in near total quiet. She tried to make small talk, but his answers were curt. his gaze fixed on his plate as though she were an interruption to his morning routine. When he finally spoke again, his words were more probing than polite. "You've been staying with my sister for some time, Miss Hartley," he said, his tone neutral, though his eyes never quite left hers. "Tell me, why is it that you've come to Ashworth Manor?" Isabella hesitated. She hadn't planned on explaining her situation. She'd never even expected to meet the Duke himself, but now, in the face of his piercing gaze, she felt as though she had no choice. I was fleeing a situation," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My cousin, he was forcing me to marry someone I could never love. I had no choice but to leave." His expression didn't change, but she could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "And my sister knew of this?" he asked. "She orchestrated your arrival?" Isabella's face flushed, the truth suddenly feeling like a betrayal. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words faltered. She didn't know what to say. Before she could form an answer, a voice interrupted. "Oh, Alexander, stop being so stiff." It was Charlotte, breezing into the room with a grin, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Miss Hartley was just telling you the story. Now, don't be so hard on her. She's not one of your grand guests. After all, you've read all the books she's read, I'm sure." Alexander's gaze flickered to his sister, a hint of exasperation crossing his features. "Charlotte, must you always be so forward?" he muttered, though there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, perhaps amusement. Charlotte shrugged and turned to Isabella. "I'm just making sure you're comfortable, my dear. After all, you're going to be spending a lot of time here, and, of course, with Alexander, he's a difficult one to crack, but I'm sure you'll manage." Isabella's heart skipped at the mention of Alexander's name. She couldn't deny the effect he had on her, his quiet intensity, his dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. But there was something more beneath that cold exterior, something she couldn't quite place, and it both terrified and intrigued her. As the breakfast continued, Alexander's questions became more probing, less dismissive. There were brief moments where his icy facade seemed to melt, if only for an instant, when their conversation turned to books, to philosophy. "You've read Descartes?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly soft as he glanced at her with something like genuine curiosity, in French. Isabella nodded, a little surprised by the shift in his tone. "Yes, my father believed in educating his daughters as much as his sons, and I've always enjoyed a good challenge." His lips twitched, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I see, you're not like most women, are you?" Isabella's chest tightened at the unspoken compliment, and she fought to keep her composure. "Perhaps most women are simply polite, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. For the first time since they'd met, she saw the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Perhaps," he murmured, before the moment was broken by the sound of Charlotte's voice. "Well, that's enough of the books for now. Alexander, you must show Miss Hartley to the library later. I'm sure she'll appreciate the collection." Alexander didn't respond at first, his gaze narrowing slightly as he glanced between his sister and Isabella. "Very well," he said after a long pause, his tone more businesslike than before. "I'll arrange it." As Isabella followed Charlotte out of the dining room later, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Alexander Ashworth truly was: cold, detached, and seemingly uninterested in anyone or anything. Yet there had been that fleeting moment, that small smile, that told her there was more to him than he let on. She just wasn't sure she wanted to be the one to uncover it. As Alexander finished his breakfast, he turned to his butler. "Find out everything about Miss Isabella Hartley, family, finances, connections. My sister is scheming, and I want to know exactly what game she's playing." The first week at Ashworth Manor passed in a blur of carefully engineered moments, each one seemingly innocent but always guided by Charlotte's invisible hand. Isabella quickly realized that Lady Charlotte was far from the carefree, whimsical woman she had first appeared to be. Every conversation, every encounter between her and Alexander seemed orchestrated, as though Charlotte had a hand in pulling the strings. The first of many such moments occurred when Charlotte casually suggested that Alexander show Isabella the library, the vast room filled with shelves of books that reached the ceiling. She made sure they were alone when they stepped inside, with Alexander barely hiding his impatience at the interruption, but Isabella, always eager for something to distract her from the overwhelming uncertainty of her situation, found herself drawn into a conversation with him about philosophy, a subject she knew well. She had never expected to impress a duke, least of all one as cool and reserved as Alexander, but as they sparred over poetry and ideas, she caught a glimpse of something different in his eyes, something more than the cold, aloof exterior he wore like armor. "You're not like other women who simply agree with everything I say," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. Isabella tilted her head, meeting his gaze with a hint of challenge. "Perhaps other women are simply being polite, Your Grace," she replied, her tone teasing, a small smile tugging at her lips. For a brief moment, she saw something flicker across his face, an almost smile that made her heart flutter, before he quickly masked it with a more impassive expression. It was as if he didn't know how to react to her, how to handle someone who didn't just bow to his every word. The next morning, Charlotte orchestrated yet another moment, an impromptu ride through the sprawling Ashworth estate. Isabella had always been an excellent rider, a skill her father had insisted she master alongside her brothers. The wind whipped through her hair as she urged her horse forward, racing across the estate's wide open fields. It was a feeling of freedom, of joy, that she hadn't experienced in years, but when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw Alexander watching her with a look of genuine surprise and something else, admiration. As they slowed down, Alexander caught up with her, his expression guarded. "Where did an earl's daughter learn to ride like that?" he asked, his tone curious, though still distant. Isabella smiled, feeling the rush of wind settle into her chest. "My father believed girls should be as capable as boys," she answered, her voice filled with the quiet pride of a daughter remembering her father's lessons. She could see the shift in him then, a slight softening of his demeanor. As much as he tried to hide it, there was something in the way he looked at her that hinted at an appreciation beyond mere politeness. Later that evening, at dinner, Charlotte's matchmaking continued in subtle, almost invisible ways. Isabella, though still acutely aware of her status as an outsider, found herself at ease during conversations. She held her own in discussions about politics, discussing the current events of the time with a natural intelligence that earned her a few approving glances from the other guests. Yet, Alexander was ever watchful. His gaze lingered on her more than she liked to admit, his silence a reminder that he was sizing her up, even if he wasn't showing it. By the end of the week, Isabella had learned enough about Alexander to know that he wasn't simply disinterested. He was watching her, observing her every move, and there were moments, brief and fleeting, when his gaze softened, like when they were discussing books or when she challenged his ideas. He wasn't as cold as he seemed, but he had built walls so high that it was nearly impossible to see through them. The struggle between them was growing, palpable in every exchange, every glance, and Isabella wasn't sure if she was winning or losing. What she did know, however, was that despite her best efforts not to, she was beginning to feel something dangerous. Every time Alexander's eyes met hers, the tension between them was undeniable, and though she told herself she wouldn't fall for a man so clearly shut off from the world, a part of her wondered if she already had. At the same time, she was fighting her own emotions. She could feel herself becoming more attached, more drawn to him than she ever expected to be, but she couldn't afford to fall for a man who clearly had no interest in love, and every time he looked at her with that cool, calculating gaze, she reminded herself of that truth. Her thoughts were interrupted when Charlotte caught her alone in the hallway. "Isn't it lovely?" Charlotte asked, her voice light with satisfaction. "The way you two seem to challenge each other. I do believe my brother is starting to notice you." Isabella's heart skipped, but she quickly masked her emotions with a neutral smile. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, please," Charlotte teased, her smile wide. "I've watched you too, the way he looks at you when you speak about books, the way he actually listens, he's interested, I can see it." Isabella felt her cheeks flush, and she quickly turned away, hiding the feeling of warmth that had crept into her chest. "I think you're mistaken," she said softly, but Charlotte simply laughed, the sound filled with knowing amusement. "We'll see, Miss Hartley, we'll see." That evening, as they walked past the drawing room, Alexander cornered Charlotte in the hallway. His face was tight with suspicion. "What game are you playing, sister?" Charlotte's innocent expression didn't fool him. "No game, I simply brought home a friend," she said, her voice light and teasing. Alexander narrowed his eyes. "Liar, you've never had female friends. What do you want?" Charlotte smiled sweetly. "Only your happiness, brother. Why? Do you find Miss Hartley interesting?" Isabella spent the next few days at Ashworth Manor trying to find her footing in a world that still felt like a dream, one moment serene and luxurious, the next uncertain and overwhelming. It wasn't until Dowager Duchess Catherine invited her for a quiet afternoon tea that the veil of mystery surrounding her new life began to lift. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth did little to ease the tension in Isabella's chest. But Catherine's presence was a comfort, a reminder that not all was cold and calculating in this world of titles and privilege. The Duchess was elegant, her sharp eyes seeing more than Isabella ever expected. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," she said, her voice gentle yet direct, "how did you come to be in such a situation?" Isabella hesitated, the weight of her story feeling heavy in her chest. She had never told anyone the full truth about her parents' death, the forced engagement to Mr. Grimsby, the years of living under her cousin's thumb, but there was something about Catherine, something that made her feel safe, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could finally tell someone. With a deep breath, Isabella began to speak, her voice shaking as she recounted the pain of losing her parents 4 years ago, and the burden that had been placed on her ever since. Catherine listened intently, her expression softening as she absorbed the details of Isabella's plight. "Your cousin is a cruel man," Catherine said, her voice low with sympathy, "and you are strong to have borne it for as long as you have." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to appear weak. I just wanted to be free," she murmured. Catherine placed a hand over hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "You are free now, my dear, and you need not worry about what comes next. We will take care of you here." The conversation turned then to Alexander, and the Duchess's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. "My son," she began, her tone filled with a mixture of love and sorrow, "he loved once, you know, before Margaret. He was a different man then, but that woman, Margaret, she broke him." Isabella listened closely, her heart aching for the man she had come to know as aloof and distant, the man she now wondered if she might be growing to care for. Catherine continued, telling her of Alexander's engagement to Lady Margaret Westbrook 5 years ago, how he had been madly in love with her, and how, just days before their wedding, Margaret had eloped with Alexander's best friend, Thomas. The scandal was enormous, and Alexander, crushed by the betrayal, had shut himself off from the world. "He has never been the same," Catherine murmured, her eyes distant. "I thought, when Charlotte brought you here, that perhaps you might be the one to make him feel again. He needs someone who can break through that icy barrier he's built around his heart." Isabella, still reeling from the revelation, felt a pang of sympathy for Alexander. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing someone you loved so deeply, especially in such a public, humiliating way, and yet, as much as she felt for him, she knew she couldn't fall for someone so emotionally scarred, so closed off. She was just here for a trial, a temporary stay, a chance to escape her past, nothing more. That evening, as the sun set and the estate seemed to quiet around her, Isabella found herself walking through the gardens, lost in thought. She hadn't expected to learn so much about the Duke, or to feel so drawn to him despite his coldness. As she wandered, her thoughts were interrupted by a note, delivered by one of the servants. It was from Alexander, and her heart skipped a beat as she read the terse, yet strangely personal, words, "Miss Hartley, please join me in my study, we have matters to discuss." Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter, but she quickly composed herself, her mind racing. What could he want to discuss? She had only just arrived, and already she was being called to his study. She hesitated only a moment before heading toward the manor, the long corridors seeming to stretch endlessly before her. When she arrived at the door, she knocked softly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Enter," came his deep voice, and she pushed the door open. Alexander stood by the fireplace, his posture stiff as he turned to face her. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, his eyes intense, "I've had some inquiries made regarding your past. Your cousin, he's a man of wealth and influence, but he's also controlling. I want to know exactly what it is you're doing here." Isabella froze, the blood draining from her face. She had suspected that Alexander might be suspicious of her, but hearing him voice it so plainly, so coldly, made her stomach drop. "You fled your cousin's house," he continued, his voice almost accusing, "running from a forced marriage. My sister brought you here as part of her matchmaking scheme, and I want to know, are you complicit in this deception?" His words hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Her mouth went dry, and her mind raced for a response. Was this the end of her stay at Ashworth Manor? Had she been brought here under false pretenses, and if so, could she defend herself? The uncertainty gnawed at her as she looked into his piercing eyes, knowing that how she answered now could shape everything that came next. Alexander's eyes were hard as stone as he waited for her reply, papers still clenched tightly in his hand. "I'm waiting for an answer. Miss Hartley, did you come here with honesty in mind, or are you just another one of my sister's pawns?" The air in Alexander's study was thick with tension as Isabella stood frozen, the weight of his accusation pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come, but hearing the words spoken so coldly, so matter-of-factly, felt like a slap in the face. She wasn't used to defending herself. She had spent years in a position where speaking up only brought more punishment. But something about the way Alexander's eyes pinned her to the spot, his tone, sharp and unwavering, ignited a spark of defiance in her. She began, her voice trembling, but he cut her off before she could say anything more. "A penniless gentlewoman, desperate, of course, a duke must seem like a prize," he said, his words laced with suspicion and bitterness. Isabella's chest tightened, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she cared to admit. How dare he think she was like the other women who had tried to trap him for his title? She wasn't some fortune hunter, some schemer looking to better her station. She had never asked for this, never wanted any part of it. The fury that had been simmering beneath the surface for days suddenly surged to the forefront, and without thinking, she took a step forward and slapped him across the face. The sound of it echoed in the silence of the room, sharp and final. Alexander stood still, his face reddening from the impact, his eyes wide with shock. Isabella's heart was racing, but the rush of anger made her feel momentarily alive, as though she had finally taken control of her own fate. "You think I'm like them?" she spat, her voice barely above a whisper, shaking with emotion. "You think I'd sacrifice my dignity for the chance to be your wife?" She shook her head, the tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilling down her cheeks. "I may be poor, but I have my dignity. If you believe me capable of such deception, I'll leave at dawn." She turned on her heel, her pulse thundering in her ears, and started toward the door, her mind set on leaving this house, this strange and suffocating world that had promised so much but offered so little. But as her hand reached for the door, she felt a firm grip on her wrist, pulling her back. "Wait." Alexander's voice was low, almost pleading, a stark contrast to the anger that had filled it moments before. He released her wrist, his face softening with genuine regret. "That was unfair," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. "I've grown accustomed to women having ulterior motives, I assumed." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, Isabella saw something in his eyes, vulnerability, uncertainty, a flicker of emotion that he quickly masked with a cold indifference. "Then I pity you, Your Grace," Isabella replied, her voice thick with the weight of her own hurt. "What a lonely existence, to see only manipulation in everyone who comes near you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, the space between them heavy with unspoken truths. Then, Alexander took a step closer, his gaze softening ever so slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, filled with an unfamiliar humility. "I shouldn't have assumed. You deserve more than that." Isabella swallowed hard, the anger still simmering beneath her skin, but there was something in his apology that made her hesitate. She hadn't expected him to apologize, and yet, there was something about the way he spoke that made her wonder if he wasn't as emotionally distant as he had tried to appear. "You think I'm incapable of trust," she said quietly, her words more vulnerable than she had intended. "But I'm not. I came here because I had no other choice, and now I'm caught in something I don't understand." Alexander's eyes softened even more, his usual aloofness slipping for just a moment. "I know," he said, his voice low. "I know it's not fair to ask this of you." He took a deep breath, his gaze searching hers as if trying to find something. "Let me explain, Miss Hartley, please." He stepped back slightly, as though giving her space to breathe, and Isabella, despite herself, stayed. She wanted to leave, to escape this complicated web of emotions that had no place in her life, but a part of her, just the smallest, most foolish part, wanted to hear him out. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away, his expression distant once more, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark and painful. "Margaret," he said after a long pause, his voice tight, "she was the love of my life, or so I thought, and she destroyed me, she betrayed me in the worst way possible. I was never the same after that." Isabella's heart ached for him, though she tried not to show it. She had heard bits and pieces of Margaret's story, but hearing it from Alexander, hearing the rawness in his voice, made her realize just how deep the wound ran, and yet, there was still something in her that felt uneasy, something that told her she couldn't afford to get too close to him, to give him any more of herself than she already had. "I'd rather be poor than loveless," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. She looked him in the eye, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't need wealth or title, I just need—" Her voice faltered, and she didn't finish the sentence. "You've had enough of broken men," Alexander said softly, his gaze intent on hers. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart race despite herself. "But if love were possible," he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Isabella didn't know how to answer. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall for him, that she wouldn't let herself be drawn into this strange, dangerous world he had created, but standing in front of him now, with the tension between them palpable, she wasn't so sure anymore. Before Isabella could respond, the door to the study burst open, and Charlotte's voice rang out, loud and unapologetic. "Oh. Was I interrupting something?" Alexander quickly stepped back, his hand falling away from Isabella's wrist, his expression hardening once more. "We were finished here," he said, his voice a mask of indifference, but his eyes, dark and intense, followed Isabella as she fled the room. Charlotte, ever the instigator, grinned widely. "Brother, you're a terrible liar, you're absolutely besotted with her." Alexander, his voice low and tight, answered, "Leave it alone, Charlotte." But his hand still tingled from touching Isabella's skin, and Charlotte, ever observant, didn't miss the shift in her brother's demeanor. The arrival of guests at Ashworth Manor marked the beginning of a new kind of tension, one that Isabella hadn't fully anticipated. As the week-long house party commenced, the atmosphere shifted from the quiet solitude of the estate to the buzzing energy of social gatherings. Charlotte was positively delighted, her excitement practically palpable as she welcomed each new guest with open arms, all the while keeping a careful eye on Isabella and Alexander. Isabella, on the other hand, found herself sinking deeper into anxiety. She was no longer just an anonymous guest. Now, with the arrival of so many people, she was part of the intricate web Charlotte had spun, and the weight of everyone's expectations began to bear down on her. Alexander seemed more distant than ever, his attention divided between his guests and the pressing responsibilities of being the Duke, but Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her more than he let on. The first evening brought the usual formalities of a grand dinner, where the seating arrangements were carefully planned. Charlotte seated Isabella as far from Alexander as possible, much to Isabella's discomfort. Across the table, Lord Petersham, a strikingly handsome man of 28, had his eyes on Isabella from the moment he walked into the room. He was charming, with an easy smile and a smooth manner, and he wasted no time in monopolizing her attention, leaning in just a little too close during the conversation. Isabella, though uncomfortable, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief in his company. At least he wasn't cold like Alexander. But Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, watched the exchange with a carefully controlled gaze, his jaw clenched and his hand barely touching his wineglass. He seemed entirely uninterested in the conversations around him, but every time Petersham laughed or leaned too close to Isabella, Isabella could feel the tension in the room shift. It was subtle, just a flicker in his eyes, a tightening of his lips, but it was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. After dinner, the group moved to the drawing room, where entertainment was provided in the form of music and conversation. Isabella, who had always played the pianoforte well, agreed to perform. Though she was nervous, her fingers stumbled at first, but soon she found herself lost in the music, the notes flowing from her fingers as though they had a life of their own. As she played, she noticed Petersham standing a little too close, his eyes fixed on her with something akin to admiration. Alexander, seated near the fireplace, watched as well, though his expression remained unreadable. He didn't speak to her during the performance, but she could feel his gaze on her, heavy and calculating. Later, as the evening wore on and the guests retired to their rooms, Charlotte seemed more determined than ever to play her game. The following day brought more opportunities for private moments. Charlotte's careful manipulation of Alexander and Isabella's interactions continued, with frequent suggestions of riding together or exploring the gardens. At breakfast the next morning, Charlotte casually mentioned that she'd arranged for Isabella to join Alexander on a ride through the grounds, leaving the two of them alone once more. As they rode side by side, the tension was unmistakable, each word between them carefully measured. Alexander's questions were polite, but pointed, his curiosity about her history still simmering beneath the surface. Isabella, trying to ignore the underlying current of something more, something dangerous, kept her answers short, not wanting to invite further probing, and yet, despite herself, she couldn't help but enjoy the freedom the ride provided, the wind in her hair, the expansive view of the estate, the sense of being out of doors. She felt for a moment like the girl she used to be, before she'd become entangled in the tangled web of duty and survival. Alexander, too, seemed to relax, his posture less rigid as they raced across the fields. Though his eyes never strayed too far from her, they were two people caught in a dance neither of them fully understood, neither of them willing to admit the growing pull between them. At the end of their ride, as they slowed their horses, Alexander glanced at her with something softer in his gaze, something fleeting that almost made her forget the carefully constructed distance he kept. "You ride well," he said, his voice just a little warmer than usual. "Better than I expected." Isabella offered a tight smile, knowing full well that this moment, like so many others, was nothing more than a temporary truce in a war neither of them seemed to understand. The next day, as the house party continued, the subtle game of power and attraction between them grew even more palpable. Alexander's interest in her, though carefully hidden, was becoming undeniable, and even Charlotte seemed to sense the shift. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Lord Petersham had again managed to monopolize her attention, Charlotte found Alexander alone in a quiet corner of the manor, her voice low and knowing. "If you don't claim her, someone else will," she said bluntly, a teasing edge to her words. Alexander stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I'm not claiming anyone," he said, his voice cold and controlled, but there was an unmistakable flicker of something in his eyes, something he couldn't quite hide. Charlotte's smile widened, her victory palpable. "You're a fool, brother, and you're losing her," she said, before turning and walking away, leaving Alexander to stew in his own frustration. Later that evening, just as the house party guests were preparing for dinner, Alexander slipped a note to Isabella. The paper was neatly folded, the handwriting unmistakably his. "Meet me in the rose garden after dinner. There's something I must tell you." "Please." Isabella's heart raced as she read the note, her hands trembling slightly. What could he want to say? And why, after all this time, was he reaching out to her now? Isabella's thoughts raced as she made her way to the rose garden after dinner, her heart pounding with both excitement and trepidation. The note had been simple enough, but the words, "There's something I must tell you," had stirred something deep inside her. She had no idea what Alexander wanted to say, but something about the request felt different. As she stepped into the garden, the moonlight filtered through the climbing roses, casting soft shadows over the path. She had to admit, she hadn't expected the garden to be quite so beautiful, and she certainly hadn't expected it to feel so intimate. It was the kind of place that invited secret conversations, the kind of place where two people could escape the watchful eyes of the world. Alexander stood by the fountain, his tall frame barely visible in the dim light, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked different tonight. There was a tension in his posture, something almost fragile about the way he held himself, as if he were about to say something important. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft, almost unsure. Isabella's heart fluttered, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, stepping closer. "You wanted to speak with me." For a moment, Alexander didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the roses that climbed the stone wall before them. Then, with a deep breath, he turned to face her, his expression tense, almost conflicted. "These past weeks," he began, his voice trailing off as if he were struggling to find the right words, "you've become, that is, I find myself." He stopped again, his words hanging in the air, leaving Isabella to wonder whether this was the confession she had been waiting for. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of encouragement, but before she could, a sob broke the stillness of the garden. Isabella's eyes widened as she looked around, trying to locate the source of the distress. There, by the fountain, stood Sarah, one of the housemaids, her face buried in her hands as she wept uncontrollably. Without thinking, Isabella rushed to her side, her instincts as a caretaker kicking in. "Sarah, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern as she gently placed a hand on the maid's shoulder. Sarah, trembling, looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do. I've been dismissed from my last position, and I don't want to be turned away again. Please, Miss Hartley, I'm terrified." Isabella's heart broke for the girl, and she immediately took Sarah's hands in hers, trying to calm her. "You won't be turned away," Isabella said firmly, her voice full of compassion. "We'll speak to the Duchess. You won't be left alone, I promise you." Alexander, who had been standing at a distance, watched with a quiet intensity, though there was something in his expression that seemed to soften as he saw Isabella's immediate reaction to the young maid's distress. As Sarah wept, Isabella turned to Alexander, who stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Please," Isabella said softly, her voice filled with determination, "take care of her. She needs to feel safe. We can't let her be abandoned." Alexander's eyes flickered, and without another word, he stepped forward, his voice low as he addressed Sarah. "You'll stay here," he said, his tone quiet but commanding. "You have a position, and the baby will be cared for. You have my word." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and relief, before nodding, her tears slowing. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As Sarah was escorted away by the housekeeper, Isabella turned to Alexander, her heart racing as she absorbed the depth of his quiet kindness. "You have a good heart, Alexander," she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak his name, and she saw the way his expression shifted, just slightly, as if hearing his name from her lips meant something more than she had anticipated. His breath hitched ever so slightly, and he turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "When we're alone," he said, his voice soft, "please call me Alexander." The weight of his words settled between them, and Isabella's heart fluttered as the space between them seemed to shrink, the tension of the past few weeks suddenly palpable. "What I was trying to say before," he began again, his voice low and hesitant, but just as the words seemed on the verge of being spoken, a loud voice interrupted them, snapping the fragile moment. "Isabella! Alexander!" Charlotte called from across the garden, her voice bright and completely oblivious to the charged atmosphere. "It's time for the evening entertainment to begin. Don't make me drag you both inside." With a frustrated sigh, Alexander dropped his gaze, taking a step back. "We're finished here," he said, his tone quickly returning to its usual coolness, though his eyes followed Isabella as she turned to leave. The moment, so close to something meaningful, had slipped away like sand through her fingers. As she walked back toward the house, her heart ached with the weight of what almost was, and what had yet to come. The almost kiss that hadn't happened lingered in the air, unresolved, as though they were both trapped in a limbo neither knew how to escape. Their hands brushed accidentally as they walked back to the manor, and the electricity between them was undeniable, but neither spoke, and neither dared to acknowledge it. The night was still young, but the feelings that swirled between them felt like they could change everything. The next morning, as the group assembled for breakfast, Isabella received a letter, delivered on a silver tray by the butler. Her heart sank as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her cousin, Harold. Her face went white as she read the words, her hands trembling. Alexander noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Isabella's voice shook as she replied, "My cousin, he's discovered where I am. He's coming here tomorrow, and he's bringing Mr. Grimsby." Alexander's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "The man you refused to marry?" Isabella nodded, her voice filled with dread. "He'll force me to leave with him. I'm his legal ward until I turn 25, 4 months from now." Alexander's eyes narrowed with cold fury. "No one is taking you anywhere." The next day, tension hung in the air at Ashworth Manor like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Isabella, her face pale and her hands trembling, couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her as the hours ticked by. Alexander, ever the imposing figure, seemed to sense the storm brewing and kept a watchful eye on her, his gaze flicking to her every now and then with an intensity that made her heart race. The house was in an uncomfortable hush, as if the staff and guests alike were waiting for the inevitable arrival of her cousin, Harold, and Mr. Grimsby. It was mid-afternoon when the dreaded carriage finally arrived, cutting through the stillness with its wheels grinding over the gravel driveway. Isabella's stomach twisted as she caught sight of Harold's familiar face, his pompous expression as smug as ever, followed closely by the oily figure of Mr. Grimsby, his presence unsettling. The two men were escorted into the drawing-room, and Isabella, her heart racing, followed behind them with reluctant steps. Harold's eyes flicked to her the moment she entered, and he barely concealed his disdain. "Isabella, this charade ends now," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've imposed on these good people long enough, and it's time for you to return to your rightful place." Isabella stood straighter, refusing to let his words break her resolve. "I'm a guest here, not an imposition," she replied, her voice steady, though the knot in her stomach tightened. Grimsby's oily smile spread as he stepped forward, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "My dear," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet, "I've been very patient with you. The offer still stands: marriage, security, a comfortable life, a far cry from this life of uncertainty." Isabella's face flushed with anger, her eyes narrowing. "I've already told you, I will never marry you," she said firmly, the words more forceful than she had expected. Grimsby's smile faltered, but Harold's sneer only deepened. "You're being childish, Isabella," Harold said, his tone a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "What other options do you have, really? You're nothing without me. You have no money, no family to speak of, and no place in society. The sooner you accept your fate, the better." Isabella's hands clenched at her sides, but she refused to back down. "I'll never be yours, Mr. Grimsby, not by force or by your so-called offer of security." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she spoke them with conviction. Harold's eyes narrowed, and he stepped toward her, his voice lowering in warning. "You may be a guest here, but you're still my ward. You have no choice in this matter. I'll take you with me tomorrow, whether you like it or not." The room seemed to close in on her, and Isabella's chest tightened. She felt the walls of Ashworth Manor suddenly feel more like a cage than a refuge. Just as the tension was about to snap, a cold voice interrupted. "Miss Hartley is under my protection," came Alexander's voice, low and commanding from the doorway. The room turned, all eyes falling on him as he stepped into the room, his dark eyes fixed firmly on Harold. The Duke's presence was a weight, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to ease just slightly. Alexander's gaze flickered briefly to Isabella, and she could see the quiet determination in his expression. "She will leave when she chooses," he continued, his tone unmistakably final, "not before." Harold's sneer turned into a scowl as he opened his mouth to retort, but Alexander cut him off. "And I would advise you to remember your place, Harold. Miss Hartley is my guest, and I will not tolerate your attempts to bully her any longer." There was a long, uncomfortable silence as Harold's face flushed with barely concealed rage. "And what is she to you, Your Grace? A charity case?" Harold spat, his voice dripping with derision. "A diversion." The word stung, but Isabella refused to show the hurt they caused. She stood tall, her back straight, and met Alexander's eyes with quiet gratitude. "She is everything," Alexander said, his voice so calm, so resolute, that it sent a ripple of disbelief through the room. Isabella felt her heart stutter in her chest, her breath catching as Alexander's words sank in. "Everything." The room seemed to fall into a stunned silence as Harold processed the words, his calculating gaze flicked between Isabella and Alexander, the weight of the Duke's declaration settling over them like a heavy cloak. Alexander didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact with Harold, There was no doubt in his stance, no hesitation in his words, he meant it. Harold, his face twisted in disbelief and growing fury, finally spoke again. "Perhaps we can reach an arrangement," he suggested, his voice seething with anger. Alexander's eyes flashed with ice-cold fury, and his voice dropped to a dangerous low. "There is no arrangement. Miss Hartley is not property, and you are no longer welcome here." The finality in his voice made Isabella's breath catch, and she saw Harold's jaw tighten as he realized he had no ground left to stand on. With a curt nod, Alexander gestured to his butler, who promptly escorted Harold and Grimsby out of the room. "We're finished here," Alexander said, turning to Isabella, his face unreadable. Isabella could barely process the overwhelming emotion swirling inside her: relief, gratitude, and a strange, growing hope. She had been protected, not by someone out of obligation or duty, but by someone who had chosen to stand by her, someone who had chosen to say those words. As the door closed behind Harold and Grimsby, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating into the thick silence that followed. But Isabella's heart was still pounding, her thoughts spinning as she tried to come to terms with what had just happened. She had never expected Alexander to defend her so boldly, so unapologetically, and yet, here she was, standing in the wake of his words, feeling a surge of warmth that she couldn't quite explain. As the men were escorted out of the manor, Charlotte's triumphant squeal broke the silence, and Isabella turned to leave the room, overwhelmed by the rush of emotions. But as she stepped into the hallway, she found herself face to face with Alexander, who had followed her out of the room. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She stopped in her tracks, heart racing as she met his gaze. "You are not going anywhere," he continued, his words low and filled with meaning. "You're staying here, with me, do you understand?" His eyes were dark, his voice intense, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She nodded, unable to form the words to explain what she was feeling. The garden was quiet that evening, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun as Alexander led Isabella away from the bustle of the house party, toward the secluded spot beneath the ancient oak tree. The cool breeze carried the scent of roses and damp earth, but neither of them seemed to notice the beauty of the moment. Alexander's usually controlled demeanor was shattered, his expression unusually tense, his jaw clenched as if fighting something within himself. Isabella walked beside him, her heart in her throat, unsure of what to expect, yet afraid to voice the question that hovered between them. They stopped beneath the oak, its branches stretching above them like the arms of a protective giant. Alexander turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense, and for the first time, she saw something raw in them, vulnerable and conflicted. "Isabella," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't want this. I didn't want to feel anything for anyone. After Margaret, I swore I would never open myself up again. I told myself I was better off alone, that it was safer." He paused, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales. "But then you came here, you made me feel things I haven't allowed myself to feel in years, and now, I'm lost, because I can't imagine my life without you in it. You're everything I never knew I needed, and now I'm terrified, terrified of losing you, terrified that you'll leave me like she did. I'm not sure I can survive that again." His voice faltered at the end, and Isabella's heart broke at the rawness of his confession. She had always known there was more to him than the cold, aloof exterior he projected, but hearing him admit his fears, his pain, took her by surprise. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was tight with emotion. Instead, she simply reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, a touch that felt like both comfort and invitation. Alexander looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes, as if searching for some kind of reassurance. "You're not alone anymore," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with sincerity. "I'm here, Alexander. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you push me away, but I don't want to go, I want to stay." The words hung between them, and for a long moment Alexander said nothing. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, closing the space between them, his breath mingling with hers as he placed a hand gently on her cheek. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not the man I should be, but I promise you this, I'll spend every day trying to be the man you deserve." Isabella's chest tightened, and she looked up at him, seeing not the Duke, not the title, but the man before her, the man who had been hurt, who had been broken, but who was still willing to try. She could feel her heart beating faster, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just some fleeting attraction, some passing fancy. This was real, this was deep, and it terrified her just as much as it terrified him. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't need you to be perfect, Alexander. I just need you to be you, the man who protected Sarah, the man who made me feel safe, the man who stands by me even when things get difficult." She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his cheek. "I fell in love with you the moment I saw the kindness in your eyes. That's the man I want, not the Duke, not the man others expect you to be, just you." His eyes flickered, his gaze searching hers as if looking for some sign that she was telling the truth, that she wasn't just trying to soothe him with kind words. Then, as though the weight of her words had reached him, he closed the distance between them, his lips crashing down on hers in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It was a kiss full of years of loneliness, of unspoken words, of everything they had both been afraid to acknowledge. Isabella's heart raced, her hands finding their way to his chest as she kissed him back with equal fervor, the connection between them undeniable. Time seemed to stop in that moment, the world around them fading away until there was nothing left but the warmth of their embrace, the promise of something real. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting together, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was more powerful than any words could be. Alexander's breath was uneven as he looked down at her, his hand gently cupping her face. "Marry me," he said, the words heavy with meaning, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you be mine?" Isabella's heart leaped in her chest as the gravity of his question sank in. For a moment, she felt the weight of the future pressing down on her, the uncertainty of what that future might hold, but then she realized she didn't care, she wasn't afraid anymore. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." The words were barely out of her mouth before his lips were on hers again, more urgently this time, as though they both knew this was the beginning of something that could never be undone. The world seemed to stand still, the universe aligning in that single moment. When they pulled apart once more, Alexander smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes, softening his features in a way Isabella had never seen before. "You've made me the happiest man in the world," he said, his voice full of awe and wonder, and in that moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the garden, Isabella knew her life had changed forever. Before either of them could say another word, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Oh, thank heavens!" Charlotte's voice rang out, echoing through the garden as she appeared at the far end of the path. "Finally! Mama, you can stop hovering. He's proposed, and she's accepted." Isabella's heart skipped a beat, but as she turned to look at Charlotte, her joy was quickly replaced by a mixture of surprise and concern. Charlotte's expression shifted from triumph to something darker. "Oh, bloody hell! Don't look now," but another carriage just arrived, unannounced. Alexander groaned, his face darkening. "Who now?" Charlotte grimaced, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Lady Margaret Westbrook, your former fiancée." The arrival of Lady Margaret Westbrook sent a ripple of discomfort through Ashworth Manor, an unwelcome reminder of Alexander's past that neither he nor Isabella were prepared for. The sound of wheels crunching over the gravel driveway had barely faded when Margaret, graceful as ever despite her years, appeared at the front door. She was still beautiful, her dark hair perfectly styled, her blue eyes as calculating as ever, her smile just as charming and disarming as when she had left Alexander. All those years ago, the years had done little to dim her allure, and yet Isabella could see the coolness in Margaret's gaze as she took in the scene before her, particularly Isabella, who stood at a distance, unsure of her place in this strange new world of rivalries and old wounds. Alexander's face tightened as he met his former fiancée's gaze, his jaw set in a hard line that only deepened as Margaret approached him. "Darling," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false warmth, "I've come to apologize, to make amends, if I may. After all, we were once so close, before everything fell apart." Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment as she glanced at Isabella, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but then she returned her attention to Alexander, her gaze softening. Isabella could see the manipulation beneath the surface, how easily Margaret slipped into her old, familiar role, the one that had once ensnared Alexander's heart. "You came back to Ashworth Manor to apologize." Alexander's voice was colder than winter, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of something raw and unresolved that he clearly wasn't ready to confront. "Is that why you're here, Margaret? To pretend like nothing happened?" Margaret's face twisted with feigned hurt, her lips trembling as though she might cry, but Isabella saw right through her. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice thick with false remorse. "I've regretted it every day since I left Thomas. He wasn't who I thought he was. Our marriage has been miserable. He squandered my dowry, and now," she let the words trail off, her eyes flicking to Alexander's with something that bordered on desperation. "I've thought of you every day, Alexander, of what we could have had. I'm free now. My husband is dead. I thought, perhaps we could start again, finish what we began." There it was, the hook, the invitation to step back into the life they once had, the life that Alexander had given up on after her betrayal. Isabella watched in stunned silence as the Duke's posture stiffened, his eyes cold but conflicted. He didn't respond right away, and in that pregnant pause, Isabella could feel her stomach tighten. The thought of Alexander returning to Margaret, of their past being dredged up and relived, twisted something deep inside her. She could barely breathe as Margaret stepped closer, her every movement calculated, each word a reminder of the history they shared. Margaret reached out, a hand placed on Alexander's arm, a gesture that seemed so natural to her, but so wrong to Isabella. The air in the room thickened with the weight of the unspoken questions between them. Was this a step toward reconciliation, or was it simply the same old manipulation that had once torn them apart? Isabella forced herself to look away, to look at Alexander, to see if his heart was still vulnerable to the woman who had left him so easily, and to wonder if she, too, could find her place in this world he had once shared with another. She wanted to believe that she could be the one to heal him, to offer him something real, but the look in Margaret's eyes left her feeling small and insignificant, as if she were nothing more than a temporary distraction. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence thick with the ghosts of a broken past. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice a low, emotionless growl that cut through the charged air. "There is no alas," he said, his words hard and final. "There hasn't been for 5 years." Margaret blinked, her lips parting as though she hadn't expected the rejection to be so swift, so certain. "I made a mistake," she repeated, her voice pleading now. "I was young, I didn't know what I was doing, but now, Alexander, we can make it right, we can fix this." Her words were desperate, but Alexander wasn't swayed, his eyes never left hers as he continued. "I loved you once, but that man is gone, and in his place, I am someone else, someone better. I've moved on." There was a bitter edge to his words, and the finality in his voice left no room for argument. Margaret's expression shifted, from regret to something sharper, something calculating. "You think you've moved on?" she asked, her voice rising with a hint of venom. "You've fallen for someone else, haven't you? This girl." Her eyes flicked to Isabella, and the disdain in her gaze was unmistakable. "You're nothing but a distraction, you're nothing but a means to get over me. Don't think I don't know that." The accusation hit Isabella like a slap, but she stood her ground, refusing to be cowed by Margaret's sharp words. Alexander's gaze shifted to Isabella then, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. His were filled with something that looked almost like guilt, but also something else, something deeper, more certain. "You're wrong," he said quietly, his voice steady and strong. "I'm not with her to forget you, I'm with her because she's real. She's not the fantasy I once had, she's someone I can trust." Margaret's eyes flickered with a brief flash of realization, then narrowed with anger. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. "I will make sure of it. You'll see, you're making a mistake, Alexander," and she turned toward Isabella, her eyes like daggers. "She'll be the one to pay for it." As Margaret stormed out of the room, leaving the tense silence in her wake, Isabella's heart pounded, her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus on the moment before her. Alexander had stood firm in the face of Margaret's manipulation, but what if there was more to it than that? What if Margaret's words weren't as empty as they seemed? Isabella couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot, and just as she was about to speak, to ask Alexander if he was truly certain, she heard the soft click of the door behind her. It was Charlotte. "Well, that was a spectacle," she remarked casually, her eyes glinting with amusement. "But don't worry, Isabella, Margaret has no power here anymore. She'll slink away like she always does." Still, Isabella couldn't help but feel a sense of unease linger in the air. The hours after Margaret's visit felt like an eternity to Isabella, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy over her as she retreated to her room, her mind racing with everything that had been said. She couldn't help but replay the scene over and over, Margaret's biting words, Alexander's firm rejection, and the unmistakable sense of finality in his voice. Yet, even as she tried to calm herself, a gnawing doubt took root in her chest. Had Alexander truly moved on, or was Margaret right? Was she just a distraction to him, a temporary escape from the pain of his past? The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. Had she misread him? Was she just a fleeting comfort, something to help him forget the woman who had betrayed him so utterly? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and the next morning, as she made her way downstairs for breakfast, her heart was heavy with unspoken questions. When she entered the dining room, she found Alexander already seated, his usual aloofness replaced by a brooding intensity that matched her own unease. His gaze flickered to her as she entered, but he said nothing, he merely nodded, a silent acknowledgement that seemed distant, even cold. Isabella hesitated before sitting down, her mind torn between confronting him and staying silent, but as she met his eyes, she saw something that made her stomach twist with uncertainty, a flicker of guilt, or was it discomfort? She couldn't tell, but it unsettled her all the same. After a long silence, Alexander finally spoke, his voice tight. "Isabella," he began, his tone strangely cautious, "I need to explain something." Her breath hitched at the sound of her name, and her heart raced, but she didn't interrupt, waiting for him to continue. "I know you must think I'm a fool," he said, his voice rough, "that I'm still haunted by Margaret, but I'm not. What I said last night, what I said to her, was the truth. I've moved on, and it's because of you." Isabella's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. The words were more than she had expected, and yet they left her feeling strangely unsettled, as if she couldn't quite believe them. "I never wanted to hurt you," he continued, his voice softer now, the walls around him starting to crack. I thought I could live without love. I thought I could be alone, and that would be enough. But when you came into my life, when you challenged me, when you didn't just accept my walls, you saw beyond them, I realized I had been lying to myself." Isabella's heart beat faster as he spoke, her emotions whirling in a way she hadn't expected. Was this truly happening? Was he admitting, finally, what she had feared to ask? "You're not just someone who came here to fill a space," Alexander went on, his eyes searching hers. "You're the woman I want by my side, and I don't know how to explain it, but I know I can't lose you, not like I lost her." His gaze softened, a vulnerability slipping through his usual mask. "I never wanted to put you in a position where you thought I was still grieving her, but the truth is, I was, but it's different now. Isabella, you've made me feel again, and I'm terrified of losing that." Isabella's chest tightened, her mind racing to catch up with his words. Her heart soared at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the raw honesty in his voice, and yet, a part of her couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep inside. What if his past was too heavy to let go of? What if this was just another in a long line of broken promises? "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know what to believe anymore. After everything that happened yesterday, after what Margaret said, I need to know the truth. Are you with me because of who I am, or because you can't let go of your past?" The question hung between them, the silence thick with the weight of it. Alexander's face softened, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm with you because of you," he said, his voice steady now, firm with conviction. "I'm with you because you've shown me a love I never thought I could have. You don't need to be anything other than yourself. That's what I love about you, your kindness, your strength, your honesty, and that's why I want you. Isabella, you are everything I never knew I needed." Isabella's heart swelled, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes as she heard the truth in his words. She had been afraid that the past would hold him back, afraid that she wasn't enough, but now, with him standing before her, there was no doubt in her mind that this was real. He wasn't just offering her a fleeting moment of comfort, he was offering her his heart, truly and completely. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, "and I want to stay. I want this, us, more than anything." The words had barely left her lips before he stepped forward, pulling her into his arms, holding her close as if he never wanted to let her go. The world outside faded away as they stood there together, the warmth of his embrace the only thing that mattered. But just as they stood there, wrapped in the silence of their shared understanding, the door to the dining room opened, and Charlotte stepped in, a mischievous smile on her lips. "Well, that's all very touching," she said with a smirk, "but I think you two might want to come out of your little bubble. There's something a bit more urgent to attend to." Isabella pulled away from Alexander, her heart still racing, as Charlotte's eyes gleamed with excitement. "It seems there's an uninvited guest at the door, someone who has a lot to say about your future, Alexander." Alexander's expression darkened. "Who now?" he muttered under his breath, already dreading the answer. Charlotte's grin widened. "Lord Petersham, and, judging by the look on his face, he's not here to congratulate you." The day of Isabella and Alexander's wedding arrived with a quiet kind of brilliance. The estate was alive with movement, guests arriving from all over the region, but for Isabella, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. In the small, intimate chapel on the grounds of Ashworth Manor, everything was perfectly arranged. Flowers adorned the pews, candles flickered in soft, golden light, and the air was filled with an unmistakable sense of joy. Isabella, in her ivory silk gown, stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, her heart thumping in her chest, her reflection barely registered in her mind. What mattered most was the man waiting for her at the altar, the man who had stolen her heart without even meaning to. She'd never imagined this day would come, for months ago. She had been running for her life, unsure of where she was headed, and now here she was, a duke's bride, standing on the edge of the rest of her life. As she touched the delicate lace of her veil, a quiet knock sounded at the door, and Charlotte's voice, filled with excitement, called from the other side. "Isabella? Are you ready? You look absolutely radiant, I'm sure of it." Isabella's heart swelled with affection for Charlotte. Over the past few weeks, Charlotte had become more than a matchmaker. she had become a true friend. Isabella had no idea what her life would have been like without Charlotte's relentless encouragement and support. "Come in," she called softly, her voice trembling with anticipation. Charlotte entered with a wide grin on her face, her eyes gleaming with unspeakable joy. "Isabella, you look stunning, simply breathtaking." Charlotte's gaze softened, a tenderness creeping into her expression. "I'm so happy for you. Alexander doesn't deserve you, of course, but then again, who does?" Isabella laughed softly, the nervousness fading just a little with Charlotte's teasing. "Thank you, Charlotte. I never thought I'd be standing here like this. I didn't think I was worthy of this kind of happiness." Charlotte stepped forward, taking Isabella's hand in hers. "Don't be ridiculous, you've earned every bit of it. Alexander has always been a bit of a fool when it comes to love, but he's not one anymore. You've made him see that. You gave him something he never had, a reason to hope again." Isabella smiled, the emotions that had been swirling in her chest for so long finally beginning to settle. She looked up at Charlotte, who had become more like a sister in such a short time. "Thank you for everything," Isabella said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in us when no one else did." Charlotte gave her a wink, the lightness in her eyes never wavering. "Oh, I knew it all along, and besides, I think I deserve some credit for orchestrating the entire thing, don't you?" Isabella laughed again, the sound lighter now, filled with warmth. "Of course, you do. You're the mastermind behind it all." After a few more words of encouragement, Charlotte stepped back, giving Isabella room to breathe. "I'll leave you to your moment," she said, her voice full of fondness, "but you better get out there before Alexander comes storming in and drags you away himself." With a last smile, Charlotte left the room, leaving Isabella to gather her thoughts before stepping into the next chapter of her life. Outside the chapel, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the estate. The guests had gathered, their faces filled with anticipation, and as Isabella stepped through the doors, she felt her heart skip a beat. There, at the altar, stood Alexander. His dark eyes were fixed on her, a mixture of awe and affection that took her breath away. He looked dashing in his formal attire, but it wasn't the clothes that caught her attention, it was the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the world. The moment their eyes met, everything else faded into the background. She moved down the aisle slowly, her every step filled with the weight of the moment. She had never felt more beautiful, more alive, than she did right now. Alexander's gaze never wavered, his expression softening as she came closer. As she reached the altar, he took her hands in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I was lost before you, you found me." His words, simple yet profound, made her heart swell. She smiled, her own voice shaking as she replied, "I was alone before you, you gave me a home." The vows came next, the traditional promises of love, loyalty, and faithfulness. Isabella spoke her vows with every ounce of sincerity in her heart, the words flowing easily from her lips, for they were the truest promises she had ever made. When Alexander spoke his voice cracked slightly, the emotion palpable in every syllable. "I vow to love you, Isabella," he said, his voice trembling. "I vow to be the man you deserve, the man you've already made me. I will protect you, cherish you, and love you every day for the rest of my life." The ceremony culminated in the exchange of rings, the symbol of their promises to one another. The kiss that followed was soft, tender, and full of all the things they had both longed for: peace, happiness, and an unwavering bond. The guests cheered, their applause ringing through the chapel as they were pronounced husband and wife. The reception that followed was nothing short of magical. The garden, illuminated by fairy lights, was filled with laughter and joy. The soft strains of a string quartet played in the background as guests danced under the stars, and Isabella and Alexander shared their first dance as husband and wife, the world around them fading away. Charlotte, always the center of attention, raised her glass in a toast, her voice loud and playful. To the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, may you live happily ever after, and may my matchmaking skills forever be remembered. Laughter erupted around them, and Alexander shook his head with a smile. I suppose we should thank her, he whispered to Isabella, his hand resting gently on her waist. I'm not sure we'd be here without her. Isabella smiled, her eyes sparkling with affection. I think you're right. I'll make sure to thank her for the rest of my life. As the night wore on, Isabella found herself in a quiet moment with Alexander in the library, the soft glow of candlelight casting shadows across the room. Hello, wife, he said softly, his voice full of warmth as he cupped her face in his hands. Hello, husband, she whispered, her heart full of love as she leaned into his touch. Their kiss was slow, lingering, a promise of everything that was to come. I have something for you, Alexander said, pulling back slightly to retrieve a small deed from the desk. Your father's estate, he said, handing it to her. It's yours, I bought it back for you, your history, your roots. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she held the deed in her hands, the weight of the gesture hitting her like a wave. Alexander, she whispered, this is too much. He smiled, the warmth in his eyes evident. It's not too much, it's yours, for our children to play where you once played. She clutched the paper to her chest, overcome with emotion. Children, she asked softly, her heart fluttering. At least 4, Alexander teased, a playful glint in his eyes. Charlotte needs nieces and nephews to spoil. Isabella laughed, the joy in her heart undeniable. They shared another kiss, this one full of laughter and love, before the sound of Charlotte's voice rang through the door. For heaven's sake, stop being sickeningly romantic. The guests are looking for you. They pulled apart, laughing, and Isabella wiped away a tear as she followed Alexander back to the party, knowing that this was only the beginning of a lifetime of happiness. The celebration continued into the night, the manor glowing with warmth and love, as Isabella and Alexander danced through their first night together as husband and wife. The sun was setting over Ashworth Manor, casting the garden in a golden hue as Isabella sat on a bench, her hands resting gently on her round belly. The soft laughter of her 14-month-old son, Henry, echoed in the distance as he toddled around the lawn. His curly hair bouncing with each step, Alexander stood on the terrace, his eyes on her, a proud smile on his face as he watched their son play. Blissfully exhausted, he asked, his voice warm as he joined her on the bench. She nodded, leaning against his shoulder. This one kicks constantly, she said with a smile, like her mother. Alexander chuckled, his hand resting on her belly. We don't know it's a girl. She laughed, her eyes sparkling with affection. I do, and she'll have your eyes, and I'll be wrapped around her finger. The conversation slowed as they watched their son, Henry, toddle over to them, his tiny hands reaching for his mother. Mama, he said, his voice soft and curious, and Isabella scooped him up, her heart full as he snuggled into her arms. Do you ever think about that night? She asked Alexander softly, looking up at him with a gentle smile. The wrong carriage? He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Every day, best mistake you ever made. Best kidnapping Charlotte ever executed, she teased, laughing as he kissed her forehead. They sat there in the fading light, their family complete and their future full of promise. The manor, once cold and distant, was now a warm, thriving home, filled with laughter and love. I was so lost before you, Isabella murmured. No, Alexander said, his voice full of conviction, you were exactly where you needed to be, walking toward me. He kissed her softly, and as they pulled away, Henry tugged at Alexander's sleeve, demanding his attention. Laughing, Alexander scooped him up, and Isabella leaned into his side, her hand resting over his heart as they watched the sunset together, their family whole. And so, the wrong carriage became the right destiny. Isabella found not just love, but home. Alexander found not just a wife, but his heart again. Charlotte? She takes full credit and tells the story at every opportunity. Sometimes the best things come from our mistakes, from wrong turns that lead exactly where we're meant to be. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe for more tales of unexpected romance and second chances. Until next time, may all your wrong carriages lead to happy endings.